Okay, let's kick us off. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the Family Domestic Sexual Violence Recovery Alliance. My name is Kellyanne Tansley, and I'm the General Manager of the Zaya Foundation here in South Australia. We're really excited to share with you all today why we believe recovery services are essential to break the cycle of abuse. Before I go any further, I would like to introduce Sammy Cooper. Sammy is a proud Aboriginal woman from mid-North Coast of New South Wales and is the State Sector Sustainability Coordinator for the Community Legal Centre here in Queensland. We're really privileged that Sammy will welcome country for us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for your patience while we navigate all of this, and thank you so much for tuning in. It really means a lot to the people working behind the scenes who, as you can see, are working so hard. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the beautiful countries that we're all coming from today. I'm blessed to live and work and play on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yagara people in Meanjin in Brisbane. I thank the traditional owners for being caretakers of the lands and seas and of the generations before us. I thank the matriarchs who have been watching over our families for thousands of generations, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and remind us all that sovereignty was never ceded. We're all walking and playing and living on stolen land, so I ask that you tread lightly. I pay my special acknowledgement to the strength and the courage and the tenacity and the spirit of our matriarchs who have raised tens of thousands of generations as the first mothers, the caretakers, the leaders, and the first advocates. I acknowledge my people, the Gumbaynggirr people in the North Coast of New South Wales, and I acknowledge all of your elders and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people listening today. Thanks, Kellyanne.
Thank you, Sammy, for that powerful welcome to country. Before we go any further, I'd like to do some housekeeping. We recognise in our audience today that we will have victims, survivors, family members, friends and colleagues who may be worried about themselves or people they know. Please know that help is out there. There's services across Australia that can support you. We've put in the chat box a couple of numbers you should call if you need to. At the end of the session today, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask some questions of our incredible speakers. Please pop them in the Q&A section throughout this presentation, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can at the end of the session. I'd also like to remind you that this is a safe, respectful and inclusive space. We trust that your comments will reflect that. So how did we get here? Look, we're completely overwhelmed. We've got over 400 people registered to attend this launch today. For us, that's testament of how important recovery services are for women and children escaping domestic, family and sexual violence situations. 2 months ago, Sally Stevenson and I, who's speaking today, got together to have a chat about recovery becoming a pillar of the Second National Plan. This is the first time it's been recognised at such a high level. We were discussing the need to have specialist recovery services, advocates, survivors and organisations in this space from across Australia united to ensure that these aren't just words, that they become prioritised policy and funding for state and federal governments, and that by working together we can make sure funding is directed towards services that are inclusive and specialist. We know in working with women and diverse people how important it is to have services that are specialist trained and trauma informed. So we decided to come together with sister services, people and survivor advocates across the nation, and we're really excited that today we have 20 members already joined our alliance. The alliance is calling for action to make sure trauma recovery services are available for all women, all people and children, whoever needs them anywhere in Australia. And we have 4 calls for action. We're requesting that governments ensure that there's appropriate levels of funding for specialist, culturally safe, trauma and violence-informed recovery services to rapidly respond to this public health crisis. We want to ensure that there's separate children-centred trauma recovery services that are developed, funded and recognise children as victims within their own right. We're calling on the Commonwealth to recognise that trauma behaviour is a natural response to domestic, family and sexual violence, and that it's to be treated as an injury. We're also asking to ensure that victim survivors have ready access to a range of trauma-specific evidence-based therapies of appropriate duration under the Medicare benefit scheme. So this is an inclusive alliance, and if any of you attending today feel that those 4 calls is something what resonates with you, please join us. In the chat box, you'll see our website. Jump online and sign up. We'd love for you to be a part. We're really honoured to have Rosie Batty as our keynote speaker today. Rosie is an anti-family violence campaigner and former Australian of the Year, whose advocacy and determination following great personal loss has been a powerful force for change. Those of us trying to create change in the sector owe Rosie a huge debt of gratitude for raising the profile, domestic and family violence and awareness, and the awareness of the change we need. So welcome, Rosie. It's great to have you on board as an Alliance member. Can you kick us off today talking to us about why recovery services and this Alliance is essential in breaking the cycle of abuse?
I hate to be the person that mutes myself. This is the first time I've done it, and I was about to say how nervous I am and how nervous I think we all are with some teething issues. It's always difficult to speak through a computer screen when you haven't got the energy of the people in the room. But seeing all these wonderful people popping up in the chat, I know we're amongst friends, we're amongst allies, we're amongst the passionate people that are all come together to stop violence against women and children. I'm so thrilled to be here and my support to this alliance. We know why it's so important. We know why. But for those that keep needing to hear the message of why it is because we still have 1 woman a week being murdered. We still know how many women, 1 in 4 over the age of 15, being affected by intimate partner violence. That's at least 2.2 million women. The numbers are staggering. They're overwhelming. They're unrelenting. They're heartbreaking. They don't go away. It doesn't stop. We need to keep coming together and we need to keep pushing. 54% of these women have children in their care. We need to recognise the importance of children being part of the recovery support that's required. Often children are lumped with mum or invisible or forgotten entirely. It is so imperative that to prevent violence, we need to challenge the way that we respond to children, the way children, as we know, respond to trauma differently. And if we're going to prevent and stop violence from reoccurring, we need to acknowledge and respect that they need to also be brought into our recovery alliance. Anyone that's involved in the frontline services knows that we do have constant struggles to be adequately funded in the crisis area. All our energy has been invested in keeping women and children safe. And it's an impossible task on so many levels, but it's one we strive to do. But we know it doesn't just end, and it's not just about crisis. And I personally know, and my journey has been very public, that recovery can be for many a lifelong journey. It is unique, it is complex, it is individual. And we have to start to recognise the importance of adequate funding and specialised services to help people on that recovery journey. So I'm delighted to be part of this alliance. It's a collective of passionate advocates, people with lived experience, organisations who specialise in those frontline spaces. Collectively, we make change. Collectively, we are voices that cannot be ignored. And I'm alongside some other inspiring people and want to acknowledge and honour the women, the women's organisations and survivors whose courage and resilience precedes us. Their bravery and passion inspires us, and the legacy of their work we hold with utmost respect. We recognise that the journey of recovery for each individual is unique, ongoing, and for many, their greatest challenge. I'd like to introduce Sam. Samantha Cooper is a proud Goomba woman. Her experience in the sector includes running a pilot for the high-risk team in Moreton Bay, working with vulnerable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, which was actually implemented. In her role as the State Sector Sustainability Coordinator, that's my fault, at Community Legal Centres, she initiated the First Nations Strategic Plan for legal aid in Queensland. Sammy is a law student and a survivor advocate. Look forward to hearing from you, Sammy.
Thank you so much, Rosie. We are all so blessed to hear from you and just to work alongside you. Honestly, we can't thank you enough. So thank you so much. I think I'd just like to start by saying the photo that was on the flyer was taken the day that I walked out of court after my abuser pled guilty to breaking into my house and strangling me in the middle of the night. And I don't say that to draw shock, but to draw attention to what justice and recovery looks like for First Nations people. We're not the same. I don't look happy or sad in that photo, but perhaps what Arnie Professor Chelsea Watergo might call sovereign. There was no hope invested in the outcome of that court date. That wasn't going to be my sense of justice or the beginning of my road to recovery. My justice came when I made him walk through the doors of the district court to answer for what he did. And my recovery came from my community over the following weeks and months and years, as we know. That day was my chance to tell him and the world, you don't get to try and kill a Black woman and get away with it, regardless of who you are, how white you are, or how high profile you may be, not anymore. Without recovery services, as a woman, I've been in multiple abusive relationships, and as an Aboriginal woman, in addition to this pattern of violent relationships, I'm statistically more likely to end up in prison than I am to finish my degree. I am 75 times more likely to be hospitalised from DV and have been on several occasions. And the system is more violent towards me and my family and my people than ever before. Arnie Vicky said the system's not broken. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do. The system is built to fail. The system is violent. It's not built to afford women, let alone Black women, safety or justice or recovery, and no amount of reform will ever reignite my faith in the system's ability to keep me or my sisters or my daughters safe. What First Nations families need is culturally appropriate, informed recovery services, community-based organisations running culturally appropriate programs that address the current problems and the current issues for that family and help heal from the past, from the intergenerational trauma, the lived fear of police and the fear of the justice system and the fear of the healthcare system. This cannot be negotiated as an afterthought anymore. First Nations people must be given a seat at the table to design models of care that work for our people, not asked to tick the culturally appropriate box. That's not recovery. No verdict in any courtroom for those who get to live long enough to see that day or are privileged enough to see that day will ever provide us healing. That's not recovery. Crisis responses at times of need, life and death are critical and severely under-resourced, but they're not recovery. Law reform and perpetrator accountability are truly overdue, and they are pivotal in achieving societal and cultural change, but they're not recovery. These pieces of incredibly complex puzzle that is DV will never afford a woman recovery. They won't help her to trust or remind her that she's worthy or give her the skills to be in a healthy relationship afterwards or to thrive exactly as she is. And I wish someone had sat with me when I was 18 and told me that this wasn't my fault, that the bruises and the broken bones would heal, but the lessons that I had learned for survival were not healthy. I wish someone had helped pave the path to true healing and recovery. And I say those separated deliberately. I wish they'd taught me to spot the signs of DV. Culturally appropriate care would have changed my life and saved so many more of my sisters who are no longer here to speak their truth. Not at crisis point, in recovery, we need both. 3 relationships and a near lethality, and I can sit in a room of survivors and most have lived a similar pattern. My community saved me, my people saved me, my aunties and uncles saved me, a community-controlled Aboriginal organisation saved me, not the police who responded and not the courts we stood in. That's the power of culturally appropriate recovery services. Local solutions to local issues. An auntie to yarn to and an uncle to keep you safe, a friendly and familiar black face in your darkest days. These things are irreplaceable. I owe my life to the First Nations community. I owe my marriage, my health, my strength, and my resilience to the First Nations community as an Aboriginal woman. So as you hear about the need for recovery services, keep in mind the need for culturally appropriate services, the critical role community organisations play in holistic healing, and the need to fund grassroots programs to do this work in a really meaningful way. I would now like to welcome the amazing Dr. Lata Satyan, Senior Lecturer and Psychologist at Deakin University and the co-convener of the Deakin Research on Violence Against Women Hub. For the past 12 years, Lata has been dedicated to actively supporting women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds with complex needs. Through her research and tireless advocacy, Lata continues to highlight solutions to the barriers women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds face. Thank you, Lata.
Thank you so much, Sammy. It is really my privilege to be able to speak after Rosie and Sammy and to be in this panel of great speakers, Lula, Sally, Kellyanne, and Mel as well, working in the background, and so many other people who've joined us in the Alliance. I'm going to be speaking from a research evidence point of view, but also based on my work as a practitioner. Research evidence shows that supporting adult and child victim survivors is vital to them surviving and thriving. Without this, children who are affected will go on to become abusers or victims in their own adult relationships. Our research also shows that children's academic performance and cognitive functioning are affected when they're exposed to violence. Older adults also require support to address the added isolation and loneliness that they can experience as a result of family violence. Yet, we don't have a system that recognizes and supports recovery in the long term. Any support system that is developed has to address intersectional barriers and use a culturally relevant framework, just as Sammy said, to ensure people from culturally diverse communities receive support in an appropriate way. Our research and my work as a psychologist show that women and children have limited access to culturally relevant support, which limits their ability to recover. The women I first supported in 2011 continue to require support. Their children require different kinds of support at different ages. Yet when I've tried to refer them to relevant family violence services, there are none that can support them in the long term. So I've been supporting them on a pro bono basis. Yet this should not be the burden of individual people or culturally relevant organizations that Sammy mentioned as well, to support people. The nature of support can vary, be interspersed, and become essential with different life events. So we need a recovery support system that can cater to the individual needs of children and adults. Further, in language support, with practitioners trained in cultural safety is critical to help the migrant and refugee communities who speak over 200 languages and are part of the 2.2 million people who experience family violence in Australia, as Rosie mentioned. The Alliance and support for the long-term recovery, therefore, are integral to ensuring that everyone in the community has the opportunity to live well. And without us all coming together and seeking more support, people will be left to fend for themselves and will only receive the 13-week support that many services are able to offer. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Lula Dembele, my friend and a passionate advocate for survivors of childhood sexual abuse and childhood and adult domestic violence, and is a member of the Independent Collective of Survivors. Her professional expertise is in national strategic policy, gender mainstreaming, and anti-patriarchal system change. And she is focused on reframing this issue. Over to you, Lula.
Thanks so much, Lata. A privilege to be here with you all. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Kulin Nation today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and all First Nations people here with us today. I wanted to highlight the importance of lived experience when we're talking about recovery. Victim survivors are the contextual experts, and they are the ones who can tell us what is needed to stop cycles of abuse. As a survivor of child sexual abuse and childhood domestic violence committed against my mother, I have lived with the impact of men's violence against women and children since I was 3 years old. I am 37 years into recovery, and I'm still managing the ways the abusive treatment of me and my mother influences my physiological, emotional, and psychological responses to people, situations, and environments. I was very fortunate to have had a mother who believed me, a family who supported me, and those most close to me who never shamed me for the abuse men perpetrated against me. I believe this has truly been the distinguishing factor in how I have survived and lessened the worst of trauma's potential impacts on me. At the same time, I was always aware of the way society and systems viewed me and punished me for being a victim. But from my experience, I know that when we shift the burden of blame off victims, then we have a much better chance at living healthier lives. Our psychological and emotional well-being are so important to empower us to make informed choices about how we want to live our lives. But I do not think there is one end state we can call recovery when it comes to mental health. We need to recognise each individual's experience is going to be different and respect that for everyone. And I think we need to look beyond mental health in terms of recovery too. Because I can work on and manage my mental health as best as I can. But if I am continuing to experience external pressures and forces beyond my control that negatively impact my life, keeping me in survival mode, then I won't be able to recover. We need to address housing, income, access to education, resources and assets to take us beyond survival mode. Our fight or flight response constantly being activated in these circumstances. We need to protect factors of safety, financial and housing security, networks of support to mitigate against people being structurally dependent on those who would seek to abuse us. And critically, we need to see recovery as a means of breaking cycles of violence. We must focus on children's recovery from trauma to prevent re-victimization and perpetration, as Lada said. Time and time again, we see from studies across the West, Asia and Africa that when it comes to perpetration of violence against women, there are significant associations between exposure to violence in childhood and having attitudes that endorse violence against women. From a 2018 study in Ghana, it was found that men who had witnessed abuse of their mother or experienced neglect were 3 times as likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence, and men who experienced sexual abuse were 2 times more likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence. A 2020 study of sexual violence among college students in the US again identifies child abuse and exposure to parental violence as risk factors for perpetration. We absolutely must provide support and avenues for women and children to rebuild and rehabilitate their lives after experiencing domestic, family, and sexual violence, or we will fail to protect and prevent violence from occurring for the next generations too. Meaningful recovery is the circuit breaker. It's why Australia needs the Domestic Family Sexual Violence Recovery Alliance and why prioritising new funding for this critical area of ending violence against women and children is so integral right now. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, mentor and all-round excellent person, Sally Stevenson, General Manager of the Illawarra Women's Health Centre, which is the organisation behind the development of Australia's first Women's Trauma Recovery Centre. And this project, I'm so glad to say, was allocated $25 million in funding over a 5-year period in the recent federal budget. On that note, over to you, Sally.
Thanks, Lula, and thank you to all the speakers today who were very patient while we had a little bit of technical difficulty, and I personally had a little bit of a meltdown, so I apologise for that. I'm on Dharawal land. It's Aboriginal land. It was never ceded. It always will be, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And it's a real privilege to be speaking from the land of the Wadi Wadi people. Yeah, I mean, the speakers, you know, previous friends, colleagues have said so much already, but I'm just going to speak a little bit on the Trauma Recovery Centre itself and why it's important, but also why the Alliance is so important. So as Lula mentioned, I'm the General Manager of the Illawarra Women's Health Centre, and we're a feminist community-based health centre that has been operating for over 3 decades. With that experience, and as we try to manage on a day-to-day basis an ever-increasing demand to support women who have experienced or are experiencing domestic violence, it's become patently clear that there's a huge gap in the provision of services that support women to heal from the devastating physical, mental, emotional, social, financial impacts of violence and abuse. And added to that, the current landscape of services is largely fragmented, convoluted, time-bound, and at times geographically, culturally, or financially simply inaccessible. So there is that, and then we know also that those systems that are intended to support women are often also open to abuse. So as a frontline service working alongside victim survivors, we see every single day the complexity and the almost impossibility of navigating or accessing services to recover. And we continue to see the impact of violence on women and children, which we know can last a lifetime if it's left untreated or unsupported. And over this time, over the 30 years or so, we've come to really understand that trauma is an injury and that trauma behaviour is a consequence of violence, and it's not a pathological disorder of the victim. So considering what should we do, we can't just keep trying to respond to this demand that we know is increasing, we know has such a devastating impact on women's lives. So in 2019, 3 years ago, we launched a campaign to establish a special and dedicated wraparound trauma recovery service. It was kind of on the fly, but we knew unless we actually said something and did something, you know, you can only speak so much. Over these last 3 years, we've worked with victim survivors and service providers to imagine what such a service would look like. What would support recovery and healing? And with the co-design research led by Dr. Patricia Cullen from the University of New South Wales, the framework of the Women's Trauma Recovery Centre was developed. It's place-based, it's community-embedded, it's women-only, it's trauma and violence informed, and it's a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary approach that wraps those services around the individual woman, because we know women are unique and they have individual needs for their recovery and healing. The other 2 things that were critical when we put this forward was that it's free to access and it's available for as long as it takes. Now, the significance of this model that centred the voices of victim survivors was that it can be replicated across the country because it's based in community. And this was recognised by the Federal Inquiry into Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence when it was recommended at a national level to fund the Women's Trauma Recovery Centre. And as Lula said, this year we were allocated I have to admit, to our surprise, the $25 million to set it up. Many people have said, well, how did you do it? Well, there are three key elements from my view. One is that we listened from the beginning to victim survivors. We radically listened to what they wanted, and we put at the centre of that, the design of the centre was wrapped around those voices and experienced. Then we harnessed community. We built partnerships and we developed relationships, and we worked hard at that, and the Illawarra community came behind it, because I think, and this speaks to the third point, the need just resonated with so many people. We all have either experienced it or know someone who's experienced violence and abuse. We've seen the consequences, and it spoke at a really emotional and heartfelt level to those who we talked to about. They saw not just the absence of services, but they saw the absolute need for something like this. And it spoke to people at all levels, at the community level and right through to the Prime Minister's office, that we had multiple meetings on, and who eventually agreed to pay the money. And that's why I think we need the alliance. This alliance is so important. It's the same principles writ large. Domestic and family violence for victim survivors and those on the front line is hard work. It can be isolating and grinding, and we need to build solidarity in this country around the provision of those services. We need a collective community to sustain and drive us to ensure that recovery services are provided to women and children when they need them and for as long as they need them. And most importantly, we need this community to wrap around victim survivors, to centre them and to lift their voices so they are heard and we respond to them. Because we are talking about extraordinary women and children who resist violence every day in so many ways. There are those that speak up. There are those that get out of bed every day with dread in their stomachs. There are those who fight relentlessly for their children in family court, because we know that, you know, when it comes to it, women are the great protectors in the face of this violence. And we know there are those who dare to hope, because we also know that resistance comes in many forms, and it can take a whole community of those who do it to make a change. But because as a society, we have not protected these amazing people, this alliance is necessary to ensure that at the very least, and together, we're able to make amends, some kind of amends. And that is by ensuring that recovery and healing services are available to them when they need them and for as long as they need them. So please join us. It's a great cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. That was an incredible end to incredible speeches. Thank you so much to all the panelists for sharing your experiences, your stories, and why this alliance is really important. Now, we've had several questions in the chat section. First of which, Sally, I'd like to throw back to yourself. There's several people asking about how does the family justice system connect and support women in recovery, also the medical system as well.
Sorry, Kellyanne, was that to me?
It was, Sally, yes. So just talking about the family justice system and the health system, what part does it have to play in supporting women recovering from domestic and family violence?
They're both critical. We see domestic and family violence as a public health emergency. It is a health issue and it has long-term physical and mental health impacts, but we also know that there's a complete intersection and overlap between the health and the justice system. And then unless justice through that system or in a way that's appropriate for the victim is achieved, then the health impacts remain both critical and ongoing. So unless we address both at the same time in a manner that's appropriate to the victim survivor, then we're already creating barriers. And in the Women's Trauma Recovery Centre, what we are doing is going to have both of those services plus finance available to the clients that come in.
Thank you, Sally, for that answer. Any other panelists? Rosie, throwing over to you. Can you add comment to that?
I think we need the family law court system to put children at the centre, to actually recognise that what is in the best interests of children is not to force them to have ongoing visitation or ongoing parental engagement when you're a violent and abusive partner. And so the whole family law court system has to really remodel, realign, reinvent itself. There is so much advocacy that has been pushing for change in this broken, fragmented system that ruins people's lives, prevents hope of recovery. And certainly we've got a lot of the panelists who I can invisibly see them nodding. So we know how it continues to fail people. So I just wanted to make that point and acknowledge the harm it causes and how it fails so many children. You do not have a right to be a parent if you're a violent and abusive perpetrator.
Thank you, Rosie. Lata, I can see you nodding there as well. Do you have comment to add to that as well?
Thanks, Kellyanne. Yes, I just want to reiterate what Rosie and Sally said. Even all the research evidence shows that it is actually quite harmful for children to continue to engage with the perpetrator. You know, the law system has been built on the notion that the child should have access to both parents, but on which basis? You know, if it's going to be harmful for the child, why should they have access to the other parent who's the perpetrator? So this is where I think, as Rosie said, the law system has to reinvent itself. They have to look at the evidence as to whether ongoing contact is going to be beneficial for the child or not. And if it's not going to be beneficial, then they have to revisit how they're going to look at the notion of parenting itself.
Thank you, Lata. We have a question in the chat from Kay, who says, mother is an 83-year-old woman who has dementia and is also a domestic violence survivor, now in aged care. Kay says that she has said her mother can only have female carers due to her history of trauma. Kay's asking the panel, has anybody raised the issue of how to best care for women who have a history of domestic violence in aged care that don't have advocates and who are now in an environment that may trigger further trauma? Throwing it out. Lula, over to you.
I certainly am no expert in this area, but I know of someone who is. Dr. Catherine Bennett, I believe is her name, and she looks a lot, particularly at elder abuse and women's experiences of abuse in those settings. And I think the most critical thing we can do, if there aren't advocates, I know there are advocacy services for people in aged care, but if you don't have those, then we need to be talking about allowing the person to have bodily autonomy, have their choices respected. Even, you know, they might say that she has diminished capacity because of her dementia, but it has to be about respecting the person and absolutely respecting their choices. This is her, you know, end of life. Why would we not take every opportunity to care for her in a way that meets her needs? And the least we could do is provide female carers if that's what she asks for. That would be my opinion, certainly not my expertise, but there are certainly really great services. If anyone can Google Dr. Catherine Bennett and her work for elder abuse and women's abuse, please find that and pop that in the chat. They have a great network who you could reach out to, who I think could provide you much more specific and beneficial advice than I can.
Thank you, Lula. That's fantastic. For me, it raises the point of awareness raising through all systems, all professionals and all sectors, so people are aware of what trauma looks like in the context of domestic and family violence, and that they're also trained to be able to respond appropriately. That way, if there are requests from people such as Gay in relation to her mother, people in charge of making decisions in institutions understand why it's critical to respond to that request as well. I'm just having a look. We don't appear to have any more questions and we're just about on time. So I'm going to wrap us up. But I encourage everybody to jump online to our website. It's been posted in the chat box several times today. Join us and look out for future activities where we'll be raising awareness of the need of recovery services across Australia that are trauma-informed, with children-centred, and where we'll be advocating and lobbying to government to ensure that they're appropriately funded. Thank you. We've had over 200 people join us today. It's been absolutely wonderful. This session has been recorded, so we'll be sharing it all with you, and we encourage you to share it through your networks, through your communities, and join us. Thank you.